COP26, the climate summit in, I believe it is in Scotland this year, is occurring fairly soon. I believe it's in the next couple weeks. And before we get there, we need to get a decent sense of, terms, right? Like how we're going to go in. Because if we're unable to figure out exactly how people are talking to us and oftentimes at us, it's going to be difficult to promote our climate agenda, right? And I was thinking about this a lot this week because I was watching a conversation on YouTube between a couple of people. I believe Al Jazeera was doing it, and they were talking about. They talked a little bit about the difference between net zero, near zero, and zero. And it was interesting because I think a lot of us hear these words near zero, net zero, and zero as in terms of emissions, and we think that those are all good, right? Those are all strategies that can be taken in a fair and equal way to get us towards a cleaner climate, a better climate, a more hospitable planet for human beings and the animals that we live with, right? However, one of the panelists brought something up that I was thinking that was interesting, and I want to kind of talk a little bit about it too, was we actually fundamentally don't understand how net zero works. And the way that she portrayed this, the individual who was talking about this, was that net zero essentially just means at the end of the day, we will be carbon neutral, which means we can put out as much carbon as we want as long as in some way, shape, or form, we are nullifying that either by planting trees or using carbon capture or some other technology, right? Or we're doing some investing in a green startup or nonprofit or something like that, right? So you're doing a balancing act between the two. You're doing a balancing act between the emissions that you're putting out on one side and the reduction that you're doing on the other side. And one of the things that I think was interesting about the point here was essentially we have to be really careful about that accounting, right? Because essentially we're relying on someone else to decide how much emissions cuts off and counterbalances other emissions. And we don't know how they're accounting. And as of right now, there isn't any kind of international regulation about how that's counted. So there could be intentional or unintentional errors with the accounting. There could be a sense from the company that things that they're doing actually reduce carbon emissions more than they actually do. And the other thing that I think is interesting is net zero actually encourages organizations to continue polluting, to continue generating fossil fuels, to continue generating emissions. Using fossil fuels, generating emissions. And as long as these companies believe or have lied to themselves into believing that their emissions output can be nullified in some way, then there's no incentive for them to actually reduce the amount of emissions that they create, right? Because if they say, I'm just going to make up numbers here, right? So don't at me. If they say, we put out 30 tons of emissions every year, say, then they can say, oh, well, if I plant, 1 billion trees over the next 10 years, then I can nullify that because it'll generate, 300 tons of, it will reduce the amount of pollution in the air by 300 tons. So if they go through with that plan, then in theory, then yes, over 10 years, they've generated 300 tons of emissions and nullified it with 300 tons of trees being planted. But what if they don't plant the trees until year 9? Those trees are not going to start taking out the full amount of carbon emissions the first year that they're born, right? They're seedlings, they're saplings, and then they have to grow. And it's going to take a while before a tree is ready to actually remove lots of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, right? So we get into this interesting dilemma where companies think that they're doing good or are pretending they're doing good, if we want to be a little cynical, but aren't, right? And whether that's intentional or not, we have to be wary that we've essentially created a system where we said emissions are okay as long as you do other good things. But because those good things aren't well regulated, it's hard to say. The next term that I thought was interesting was near zero. Now, this actually requires emissions cuts, right? It requires organizations and countries to actually bring their emissions down. This doesn't talk about a net effect. This doesn't encourage people to continue to produce emissions. But what it does do is it says, well, in order for the economy to be green, you don't actually have to get your emissions all the way to zero, right? You can just get them near zero. And no one's really defined what near zero is. What if a company thinks that 30% is near zero? Now, that seems like an extreme example. Okay, fine. But what if it's 10%? Now, 10% sounds small, right? But what if we're talking about the US military, or which, by the way, is one of the largest, if not the largest polluter in the world? Or what if it's ExxonMobil or British Petroleum, right? 10% of their emissions might still be incredibly high. And in fact, it might still be too high for where we need to be in order to get to our climate goals, which is to limit the warming of the planet under 2 degrees centigrade. So near zero is kind of an amorphous concept, but it's friendly to corporations because they can use that ambiguity to create a semblance of nearness, right? It's the same basic concept with the net zero, except for there's less encouragement to create emissions and burn fossil fuels. There is at the same time not a direct incentive to get to zero, right? To actually say, no, we are fundamentally altering the economy to be a green economy. And if that is true, you don't get to actually do all these other things, including continue to create emissions, because that doesn't get us to where we need to be. It still has that encouraging effect, unfortunately, for how we are going to not get to where we need to be. And the other thing too is that then if we say near zero is the goal, then everyone can just go near zero and everyone can have their own sense of what near zero is. And that still allows for tons of carbon emissions to be sent into the atmosphere every year, thus warming the planet. And one thing I want to remind people here is that carbon emissions are cumulative, right? It doesn't reset every calendar year. The idea of amounts of carbon emissions put out per year is purely a human concept, right? It's not scientific. When carbon is at the top of the atmosphere, it's causing the heat of the planet, of the heat of the sun, to be reflected back down to the planet. That's what creates the warming effect. So if we're still putting tons and tons and tons of carbon dioxide or methane into the atmosphere, even if we're putting fewer tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it still just sits there, right? So unless we actually say zero, or we go carbon negative, which is something I'm going to explain in a little bit, then we actually don't have a chance of preventing warming. Now, we may prevent the warming underneath a certain level, but we still have to be aware that under no circumstances is the actual goal to say, well, it's fine and dandy enough to just get to a low amount of pollution, because that pollution still sits there. We're not grabbing it out of the atmosphere. We're not reducing the amount that's there. And it's not like it's escaping into the, it's not like it's escaping into the atmosphere particularly either. So we just have to be careful when we say near zero, because it sounds good, but it probably isn't good. It definitely doesn't get us to where we need to be in terms of what does real climate policy look like. Now, the next one is the most obvious, which is zero emissions. And it means what it says on the tin, right? Effectively, it says starting at a certain date, all these companies and all these countries will just not produce any emissions whatsoever, which is more or less the goal. But as I mentioned earlier, we still have the problem of, hey, there's all these emissions and carbon dioxide, and methane, and other greenhouse gases that are just chilling in the atmosphere still. So the problem then becomes, how do we get that out? How do we actually get the planet back into a place where we're not warming it actively, and we're reducing the effects of the warming that we've already created? And that brings me to carbon negative. So what carbon negative is essentially, on balance, this is kind of that net effect again, but on balance, when we look at all the carbon emissions that we're emitting, which hopefully at this point is no, zero, donut, right? Compared to all the mitigation effects, strategies that we're using for climate, like planting trees and using carbon capture technologies and things of that nature, we're actually bringing down the amount of carbon in the atmosphere or methane in the atmosphere. And this will allow us to go back to a time, even perhaps if we're good enough at it, before industrial levels, where the temperate nature of the planet returns, and places that have been desertified, they get normal weather patterns. Now, there are some things that cannot be undone. Obviously, once a species goes extinct, it's done for. And it's entirely possible that once a landscape has been desertified, then it's gone too. But I don't know that for sure, so I don't want to, speak on that. But I can say for sure that once a species is gone, it's gone, right? And so lots of these species bring the biodiversity that we need in order to have a healthy biome, which is just the scientific word for environment, essentially. So once we are there, we can once we're at that place where we're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and we're reducing the amount of carbon that's there, we can have a real conversation about what it looks like to have these environments that are looking like they were before industrial levels. But some of this damage may be too much to fix. So as we go into COP26, as we think about what the climate strategies have to be, I want to emphasize to the activists on the ground, who I'm sure know this better than I do, and to the politicians especially, who have been the ones who are not listening, that we have a very short window to mitigate the climate catastrophe any more than it's going to be already. Climate change is already here, and I've said that on many shows, but it remains true. The climate crisis is upon us. There's no, we can't stop it anymore. What we can do is we can mitigate the effects. And while we're doing that, and by the way, that's a moral obligation that we have, and I've talked a little bit about that on the last show. While we are doing that, we need to get ourselves pulling that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere so that we can make sure that if for some reason, we're unable to stop all emissions from happening, that we're putting them into an environment that doesn't have much by way of emissions just floating around in the atmosphere, so that the Earth kind of returns to pre-industrial levels. We get additional glaciation. The seasons are more regular. We, reduce desertification if it hasn't completely taken over a place already. We prevent more species from dying out. We cool the oceans. We bring the coral reefs back. There are untold number of benefits for going back to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we had at pre-industrial levels. And it is possible, but it's going to take a lot of work. And so when you hear things like near zero or net zero, and sometimes even zero, push back. What we need is zero and negative emissions, right? We need a way to actually fight the damage we've already done. So when you're listening to news about COP26, when you're having conversations about the climate, don't just talk about reducing. We need to beyond the point of zero so that we can essentially heal the planet, to put it in kind of a naive and silly way. But it's true. We can bring back a lot of the things that we've destroyed, but we have to put in the work. And hopefully COP26 will not be the disappointment that I've predicted that it will be. And it will be a time where we can have real strategies, binding strategies that allow us to get through the next 10 or 20 years without going through an environmental cataclysm or disaster. I can't say I'm hopeful, because I'm not, but this is one of our last chances, guys. So we need to not squander it.